So it seems that the Thousand Sons have a new set of rules coming out on the horizon. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest preview for the Thousand Sons. It looks like things might be getting a fair bit more interesting for the Bird Boys in the army, with a new formation that's going to be coming out in the not too distant future. Currently in 9th edition, I'd argue that the Thousand Sons are probably one of the more balanced codexes that they released, competing okay with the codexes that were out at the time without being enormously markedly better, unlike the vast majority of stuff that they seem to have come out with. It does mean that they've been somewhat overshadowed in the codexes that have come out after though, probably hovering around about mid-tier in the power level at the moment, certainly outshone by things like Custodes, Tau, or Harlequins. The top Thousand Sons lists do tend to make pretty heavy use of things like Scarab Occult Terminators, Rubric Marines and their Sorcerers, perhaps a fair amount of their other options just not really feeling like core parts of their army. There really is a very heavy emphasis on spells buffing those particular units, all while pouring out a fair deluge of mortal wounds. In particular, Tzaangors since the Codex update haven't really seen all that much play. They are a little bit overcosted as a unit, though it seems that there's potential for that to change if this new Tzaangor-heavy formation that they've come out with is strong enough to make them tempting. I was slightly surprised to see new rules for the Thousand Sons in this book. It's going to be coming out in the Warzone Nachmund Rift War book, one of their campaign books where they do some supplements and armies of renown. This one largely focusing on Black Legion versus Space Marines with some Chaos Knights thrown in, so I was kind of surprised to actually see Thousand Sons being featured in it. I guess Black Legion tend to be the legion that sort of force the other Chaos Legions to work together to some extent, when they do want to be putting the smack down on the Loyalists. I'm going to guess that the book will be going up for pre-order on the 23rd of April. It doesn't appear to be this week as best I can tell, and they don't generally tend to tease these books too far in advance. After the first few where they really hyped them up and no one was particularly impressed, I think they try and keep them a little bit more on the down low and just talk about the Crusade rules and a few interesting bits for the 40k armies. For the Thousand Sons though, the main news for them is that they're going to be getting an army of renown focusing on Tzaangors, and the Warhammer community article has actually shown off really quite a lot of new rules for the formation. So with these armies of renown, Games Workshop's design is usually to make a really focused army just building around certain units in the codex, to maybe shine a bit of a spotlight on one way to play a codex that's a bit different to the standard cookie cutter build. In general, the Thousand Sons codex really has put the focus on the Rubric Marines and Terminators, and I think rightly so. It's always a bit sad if your main troops aren't going to be the main focus of your army, so it is probably better to have that way around in the main book. I think it is an area though that does have potential for armies of renown to be quite interesting. If they could make a way to have a Tzaangor-heavy army be a viable list, then I think it would be welcomed just as an alternative. Multiple viable ways to play an army are quite nice to have. With these armies of renown, generally the idea is that you give up quite a lot of options within a codex to focus on the units that remain, and I must admit this formation does look like it's giving up really quite a lot of important stuff within the Thousand Sons list, to the extent where it needs to be really strong to justify itself. First up, you can't include any vehicles, no demons, and no cultists, all of which are kind of annoying blows really. Having no vehicles locks you out of certain powerful fire support pieces, something the Thousand Sons kind of struggle for anyway, unless you're just buffing up loads of fire support on Scarab Occult Terminators. Losing demons means that you can't field the Thousand Sons Demon Prince, which is really quite a nice model to stack damage and defensive buffs on. Kind of a shame that they restricted that one. It does feel like a Demon Prince would fit in fairly well in an army that seems to be all about the twisting and mutating powers of Tzeentch. Finally, cultists are handy to have around. I guess if you are going to be spamming loads of Tzaangors like you can in this army, they might just have a bit less of a role, but it's always kind of handy to have some very cheap chaff around just for screening or doing some actions if it's necessary. The next big blow is that you're only allowed to use the Discipline of Change, not the Discipline of Vengeance. Change has a bunch of really nice spells on it, -1 to hit or 4+ invul, or Doombolt if you want to throw out a bunch of mortal wounds. You really do take some heavy hits though by losing Vengeance. You can't use Temporal Surge, their new version of Warp Time, or Twist of Fate to remove invuls, or Presage for that nice +1 to hit. Finally, and also a blow to the psychic phase, you lose Brotherhood of Sorcerers. That's the universal 5+ invul and +1 to cast psychic powers. Again, one of the really nice reasons that Thousand Sons tend to dominate the psychic phase so well. The Terminators would still retain a 5+ invul because they get it from their armour, but it certainly makes things like Rubric Marines not quite as viable. Really quite a lot of fairly heavy blows to the army overall, so it definitely needs to have something quite powerful to make up for it. So for all those limitations, this appears to be what you get from the formation. There might be some other minor benefits that they didn't mention in the Warhammer community page. Perhaps the biggest flat buff is the buff to Tzaangors, Spawn and Sorcerers. They all get a 5+ invul, a 5+ save versus mortal wounds, and a 6-inch normal move that they can do pre-game. Out of those units, I actually feel that Spawn are going to be the biggest beneficiaries there. They'll really like that flat 5+ invul, it makes them a lot more survivable. The mortal wound thing is no bad thing to have in 9th edition, plenty of armies can dish out obscene amounts of mortal wounds these days, and the 6-inch pre-game move will be handy for Spawn or Tzaangor swarms. If you go first, then hopefully you can use it to close yet more distance with the enemy. If you go second, maybe it could be a little bit more helpful for trying to hide behind cover for the enemy's guns. Those apply to all Tzaangor units, so I think they'd apply to the Shaman and the Tzaangor Enlightened as well. Next up, the army gets to ignore the mere servants rule for Tzaangors. That means that you don't have to have as many Rubric Marines or Scarab Occult Terminators as you do Tzaangor units. It means that you can spout an entire army of them if you desired, just led up by a few sorcerers. Kind of necessary if you're going to build around them as the primary thing in your army. I think perhaps the biggest issue with this though is that Tzaangors are at least fairly expensive, and maybe just don't feel like one of the most efficient units in the codex, even with these buffs. Next up, they rather vaguely said that Tzaangor Shamans would generate extra Cabal points. I'd guess 1 extra per each, seeing as they generate 1 at the moment. That would make sense to me. Currently they're an Elite's choice. I do kind of wonder whether or not they might be an HQ choice within this formation. It would kind of make sense if they are going to lead these hordes of babbling bird boys into battle. Then, otherwise, as with other armies of renown, they gain access to a fair few other bits and pieces. There's at least 1 Warlord trait which they've previewed, at least 1 Kabbalistic ritual that's unique to the formation, and there'll be a bunch of stratagems as well, again that they've previewed 1 of. Taking a look at those choices, the Warlord trait is called Manipulator of Reality. This one allows you to redeploy 3 Tzaangor units and put them in strategic reserve for free if desired, but it does have the rather annoying rider that this happens after pre-game moves, so is maybe just a little bit less powerful than other versions of this rule. It means that you can't just swoop 1 Tzaangor unit to the other side of the flank and then pre-game move it 6 inches towards the enemy. That could be really quite a big power play. It still seems pretty useful depending on whether you're going first or second, but in an army where every unit gets a little bit of redeployment with those 6-inch moves, then I feel maybe it's just a little bit less vital than other places where this powerful rule crops up. I'd say perhaps the single most interesting thing about this whole formation is this Kabbalistic ritual, the Bray change. This one does cost 6 Kabbalistic ritual points, and you use it before you've cast a psychic power, but it basically means 1 power is ridiculously likely to go through, and you also get some free models back into the bargain. You roll 1d6 extra when you're about to cast a power. If the result is a cast on a 10 or more and it isn't denied, then as well as casting the power, you also get to regenerate 2d3 Tzaangors in a unit within 9 inches, or d3 Tzaangor Enlightened models. That one seems to be near enough in auto-use territory. If you do have any units like that that are depleted, you're potentially quite easily getting somewhere around 30 to 40 points worth of models back, while also making one of your powers cast reliably. Finally, for 1 command point, we have Ephemeral Existence. Hopefully just one kind of handy stratagem amongst many, though I don't think it's a particularly game-changing one. You use it when you're making a normal move, advanced move, falling back or charging with a Tzaangor keyword unit, and that unit can move either horizontally through models or terrain when they're making that move. I think it's certainly a handy one to have in your arsenal of tricks, but it feels like it's one that's going to be kind of opportunistic, as opposed to something that you're going to need every turn. Perhaps some of the most obvious uses of it could be, say, if you get wrapped and trapped with a Tzaangor unit, then this could allow them just to fall back free straight through enemy models. The Tzaangor Enlightened and Shamans have fly, but I believe it could also be helpful for them as it could allow them to interact better with terrain when they're charging, though still I think that the times that you're going to want to use it are a bit niche. Certainly not unhelpful, but also not going to come up very often. So overall, I describe this Warpmeld Pact as interesting and potentially quite fluffy if you do want to field a horde full of birds, but looking at these rules, I'll be a bit dubious as to whether or not they're really going to add much power to the Thousand Sons army. From what they've shown off here, it does feel like you're probably giving up more powerful options than you're gaining in buffs, though I think it certainly does have some interesting points. I think if I was running this army, I'd be looking to take 3 big meaty units of 5 spawn. They look very efficient with the 5+ invul built in plus a pre-game move, obviously backed up by a fair amount of Tzaangors, and certainly using that Bray Change Kabbalistic ritual when possible. I'll certainly review the formation in full once we have the full rules. Maybe there might be other interesting options in the stratagems and things that might make it a little bit more tempting. I have a feeling though, like a fair few other armies of renown, like that Space Marine Phobos one, it might be more of a fun and fluffy one, as opposed to one that's going to be stomping tournaments or anything. Perhaps a little bit of a shame. I don't think it would have really hurt too much to give the Thousand Sons a fairly strong one. They're not exactly one of the top armies at the moment. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you happen to be sitting on a massive horde of Tzaangors, I guess this isn't the worst news in the world. I'll certainly be interested to hear any of you Thousand Sons players out there, and what you make of the formation. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Warpmeld Tactics, where, as I said, I will try and cover this formation in full once we have the full rules, as well as regular 40k videos coming out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Warpmeld Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.